Chapter 19 Two Unexpected Heroes. Spring slipped away, and it was summer again. The children helped Father and Robert cut and store the wild hay. Then the three adventurers took their buckets and went out into the woods to harvest the summer berries for their mother. There were blueberries for pies and puddings, and pinned cherries for quivering red jelly. There were Juneberries and wild strawberries, and later there were raspberries and blackberries and thorn apples. "I guess the Woodlawn family wouldn't have much to eat if it wasn't for us," boasted Warren. "Oh, yes," said Caddy with a twinkle in her eye. "Mother'd give us turkey." One day they crossed the river and went as far as Chimney Bluffs, a high, rocky place overlooking the river. "It's better to go to Chimney Bluffs in the spring or the fall," said Tom. "There's rattlers here in the summer, and we'd better look sharp and keep our ears open, or we'll get bit." The blueberries were thick on Chimney Bluffs, and in the excitement of picking them, it was hard to remember that one must be on the lookout for rattlesnakes. But, although the children were brave, they were not foolhardy, and life in a wild country had taught them to be cautious. Tom went ahead with a forked stick, and the other two followed him Indian file. They had almost filled their buckets when Tom found something that filled his heart with joy. "Golly!" he shouted. "This is as good as a scalp belt!" The others crowded around him and saw, bleaching in the short grass, the skeleton of a huge snake. "What a whopper!" yelled Warren. "I bet it's 4 feet long," said Tom breathlessly. "Here, you take my berries." With reckless haste he heaped his berries into their buckets and began gathering the vertebrae of the hapless snake into his pail. "Oh, say, I'll string 'em together and we'll have another show. Oh, golly, what a beauty! I wonder what Katie'll think." "Look at the size of his rattle," marveled Warren as the last pieces went into Tom's bucket. He shook it to hear the little dry buzzing rattle. Then he dropped it in the bucket, but the little dry buzzing rattle continued. "Tom, look," said Caddy in an strange urgent voice. The boy's eyes followed her pointing finger. Only a few feet away was a coiled brown and yellow snake. Its wicked little eyes glinted at them, and its tail rattled warning. With berries flying out of buckets, they fled down the hill, over rocks and bushes, helter-skelter, shouting they ran. There were other snakes on Chimney Bluffs that day. They, too, must have fled away in terror. Tom, Caddy, and Warren did not stop running until they reached the river. There they paused a moment to draw breath, and then they plunged in, clothes and all, with only their buckets balanced on their heads. "Well," said Tom, when they were safely at home, "that's the last time we go to Chimney Bluffs in the summer. But oh, crickety, didn't I get a bully skeleton!" "You shouldn't have wandered so far away from home, children," said Mrs. Woodlawn. "Perhaps it's for lack of work to do here on the farm. I'll see what I can do to remedy that." The three adventurers exchanged unhappy glances. Berrying was much more to their taste than churning, but churning it was. During the summer, when cream was plentiful, Mrs. Woodlawn churned great quantities of butter, packed it and sealed it in brown stone jars, and sent the jars away in rows in the cool box, which Father had dug and built around the spring at the north of the house. There, with the cold spring water trickling around it, the butter kept fresh until cold weather came, and so they were sure of having butter all the year round. There had been one dreadful summer which Caddy always remembered as she helped to fill the brown stone jars. Caddy knew that Mother remembered it too, although she never spoke of it. The butter had been all put up for the summer, and the family had gone to town in the wagon to meet the little steamer. That year one of their neighbors had been letting his hogs run loose in the woods. When they returned, they found that these hogs had broken through the fence, knocked the platform off the top of the spring box, upset and broken the butter jars, and rolled them in the mud, spoiling what butter they had not eaten. The Woodlands had stood silent and aghast, looking at the ruin of their winter's butter. Often their bread was without butter that year, but that was not why the children remembered the calamity so vividly. They remembered it because on that day Mother had cried, the only time that they had ever seen her cry. After that, Father had built stronger fences, and the neighbor had been persuaded to shut his hogs in a pen. Now, when summer woods and fields were at their pleasantest, Miss Parker came back from Durand and opened and swept the schoolhouse. Oh, how tedious it was to go to school in summer! Even churning on a cool back porch with a deep glass of buttermilk to drink afterward was heavenly compared to school. Through the open windows of the schoolhouse came the sounds of birds and droning bees, and the heavy odors of clover and milkweed in blossom. The eyes of the children kept wandering from their books to the window squares of green and gold where grasshoppers sang and heat shimmered in little wavy lines. Silas Bunn used to slip to the window when teacher wasn't looking and hang out so far that only his heels and the seat of his trousers was visible to those inside the room. He had done it so often with no remarks from the teacher that he no longer took the trouble to be stealthy about it. One day when he was hanging out, absorbed in watching a spider snare a fly, Miss Parker came up behind him. She stood and looked at him in a moment, while the children held their breaths, wondering what she would do. Presently, she took a firm hold in the seat of Silas's pants and lifted him out the window. Miss Parker was not very big, but then neither was Silas. She set a surprised and frightened Silas neatly on the ground beneath the window. "There, Silas," said Miss Parker, "you get up and look all around, and when you've seen all there is to see, come back to school." It did not take Silas long to see all that there was to see. After that he was a wistful looker with the other children, but not a hanger-out. The children's voices droned sleepily through the heat, like the voices of the bees and katydids. After Tom had sorted and wired together the many little bones of his rattlesnake skeleton, teacher let him bring it to school and hang it over the map of North America. That made a little break in the monotony, and then there was another break, a more exciting one. A letter came from Boston for Mother from Cousin Annabel Gray. "I shall be charmed to visit you, dear Auntie Harriet," the letter said. "Mamma and Papa think that my education will not be complete without a view of the majestic open spaces of my native land. Although I have recently been finished at the Misses Blodgett's Seminary for Young Ladies, I myself feel that I may yet be able to acquire some useful information in the vicissitudes of travel." "Wow!" said Tom, when Mother read the letter. "Does she always talk like that?" "I imagine not," said Mrs. Woodlawn. "But it's a very pretty letter, isn't it? And what a delicate penmanship!" Often over her slate or her reader Caddy's thoughts wandered to Cousin Annabel. The pleasure of her anticipation was sometimes marred by a pang of fear. What would a girl be like who could write such a letter? It sounded like a story from the mother's assistant, or the young lady's friend, those tiresome stories which were so much less entertaining than Hans Andersen's or Tom's. Caddy tried to imagine herself writing that letter to an aunt in Boston. No, Caddy Woodlawn would never write a letter like that. Couldn't she, or wouldn't she? She honestly didn't know, but it made her a little ashamed and apprehensive to think about it. The summer grew hotter and drier. The Indians did not come back, and Father said it was because they could read the weather signs and knew that hunting and fishing would be better in the north. On hot evenings, Tom and Caddy used to go down to the lake and take the canoe out to set lines for fish. Using empty corked jugs as floats, they anchored them in several places in the lake with baited lines attached to them. In the morning early, before school, they would go down and pull in the lines, and usually there would be a nice pike or two for Mrs. Conroy to bake or make into chowder. John's dog went with them to the lake, his tongue hanging out and his eyes alert for any small fish which the little building, waiting until she came out at recess and at noon. "What a horrid, ugly old Indian dog!" said all the girls, but Caddy replied, "He's mine," and she said it so fiercely that seemed reason enough why everyone should like him. One afternoon John's dog set up a mournful howl outside the schoolhouse. It was a stifling hot afternoon, and everything was as dry as a tinder box. The sun had been overcast since early afternoon, and the hope of rain was in everybody's mind. But there was no hint of rain's freshness in the hot west wind, only a queer hot smell. In the middle of the afternoon John's dog came and scratched at the schoolhouse door and gave 3 or 4 short, troubled barks. When no one paid him any attention, he came round to the window. But standing on his hind legs and putting his front paws in the side of the schoolhouse, he could just manage to look in the window. He looked around, trying to see Caddy among the other children, and he put up his mouth and uttered a long and happy howl, followed by several short barks. The children began to titter, and Miss Parker rapped sharply at her desk. "Caroline Woodlawn," she said, "will you please look to your dog?" Caddy rose obediently and went to the window to send her dog away. But what she had intended saying to the dog never came out. Instead, she turned back to the schoolroom, her hands flung in the air, her eyes wide. "Teacher, it's a fire! It's a prairie fire! It's coming here!" "Fire?" cried the children. They sprang out of their seats, throwing the quiet schoolroom into a hubbub. Miss Parker rapped again on her desk. Her face was suddenly pale, but she cried out in a strong voice, "Get back into your seats, every one of you. Don't you dare move until I tell you that you may." No danger was greater than Teacher's voice when she spoke like that. Every child but one sank back into his seat. That one was Obadiah, who had gone out of the door like a shot at the first word of fire. Miss Parker took a hasty look out of the window. "Now," she said, "gather your things together and get ready to pass out in the usual way. No running or pushing, just as usual. 1, 2, 3, march!" When they were outside, they broke ranks and scattered before the little licking red tongues of flame that were running through the dry grass toward the schoolhouse. "Run to Dunville for help!" cried Teacher. "We must save the schoolhouse if we can." Caddy caught the command and raced for Dunville with John's dog racing beside her. Miss Parker took up the bucket of water that stood by the schoolroom door. However, one bucket of water does not go very far in a prairie fire, and the spring was some distance down the road. But a firefighter was already at work. Obadiah, his head down, the smoke swirling all about him, had caught up a flat board and was beating out the fire as fast as he could. When his brother Asher saw what he was doing, he caught a board too and ran to join him. The other boys, forgetting their panic and a common purpose, began to imitate the two Jones boys. "Hey, you!" shouted Obadiah to Tom. "Get a shovel or something to dig with." In the schoolhouse, Tom found the shovel they used to make the path through the snow in winter. He knew what Obadiah wanted, and he began to dig and scrape the dry grass in a trench between the oncoming fire and the schoolhouse. The ground was baked almost as hard as a rock, and the shovel was not sharp. It was slow work, and sweat stood out over all Tom's face after a few moments of digging. "Here," said Obadiah, and he grasped the shovel and thrust his board into Tom's hands. The board was already charred and smoking, but Tom seized it and fell to beating back the fire, while Obadiah threw his strength into clearing a trench around the schoolhouse before the fire reached it. Obadiah's great hulking frame, which fitted so badly into the school benches and desks, seemed splendid at last. No grown man could have done braver or harder work than Obadiah did that day to save the schoolhouse. When Caddy came panting back with several men from the store and tavern at Dunville following her, Obadiah and the boys had already succeeded in turning the fire aside. The schoolhouse stood safe and sound on a little island, surrounded by a trench and a ring of blackened and beaten grass. With the help of the men from Dunville, the rest of the fire was extinguished before it reached the town. And then the children came back to school, but there were no more lessons that day. "Children," said Miss Parker, "you've all been very brave, but one among you has been a hero today, and I want you to salute him. Obadiah Jones, please come up here in front." Grinning a little sheepishly, Obadiah came forward. His face was blackened with smoke, and his hands were cut and burned, but he had lost his old hang-dog slouch. Obadiah stood straight as a man. The little schoolhouse rang with the children's cheers. "You owe your lives to someone else, too, children," said Miss Parker. She went to the door and opened it. Indian John's dog slunk in and came and put his head on Caddy's lap. He knew that he did not belong inside, and yet here he was, and strangely enough, everyone was petting him. "I hope you are all properly thankful," said Miss Parker, "and now you may go home. We've had enough for one day."